Good morning, welcome everyone. I'm Mark Tokola of KEI. The Korea Economic Institute is a public policy institute based in Washington, D.C. If you'd like to see more of our commentary on the Korean Peninsula, I'd refer you to our website, which is at keia.org. The topic this morning is South Korea's response to new national identity pressures. So it's easy to see that China or Russia or North Korea would apply pressure to South Korea to follow policies that would serve their interests. But it's also true that even South Korea's friends, such as the United States and Japan, also have their pressures to apply. This is a very timely discussion this morning. The Ukraine war has changed the global policy environment, but also we're having a change in leadership of some of the key countries. So in South Korea, we've got President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol, who will be inaugurated in May. In Tokyo, Kishida is relatively new, and we're still well within the first half of the Biden administration. In any discussion involving North Korea, China, and Russia, you're bound to get entangled in policy options discussions. We're going to try to avoid that. The authors have been very good about keeping their papers focused on national identity, and that's our intention today too. And I've got some breaking news. In this morning's news, the Blue House, which is Seoul's equivalent to the White House, has just published a book. It's a collection of essays and speeches by President Moon Jae-in. The title of this book is A Nation Not Swayed by Anyone, in which he claims that he succeeded during his past 3 years in honoring his promise to make sure South Korea cannot be influenced by outside powers. This morning's press commentary is that no one believes that. But it's a perfect setup for today's discussion. We have 3.5 speakers today. We have Andrew Yo of the Catholic University and the Brookings Institution. He will talk about US pressure in the form of the Biden administration's human rights advocacy, what that means for South Korea. We have Gil Rosman, who is the Emeritus Musgrave Professor of Sociology at Princeton University, who will discuss South Korea's response to China's wolf warrior diplomacy. The half speaker I mentioned is that Gil Rosman has Anthony Rinna's proxy to present his views on Russian pressures on South Korea. Anthony Rinna cannot be with us, but he's a senior editor of NK News. Gil Rosman is a Russia expert, as well as being an expert on other areas of Northeast Asia in his own right. And he'll be able to more than channel Anthony Rinna's views. And we have Kumin Seon of Ohio State University, who will talk about South Korea's national identity in the light of inter-Korean relations. That may be the ultimate test of Korean identity. So we'll hear each speaker. I think I'll ask each speaker one question as kind of a transition between them. And we'll start with Andrew.
Sure. Okay, so good morning. Thanks for the audience members who decided to wake up early and show up to our panel. And I want to thank KEI, especially Gil Rosman, for bringing us all together. So the title of my paper is Pressure on the Values Front, Biden's Human Rights Advocacy and Implications for South Korea. And the theme of this panel really is looking at identity and then perhaps clashes of identity that might exist in Northeast Asia with South Korea foreign policy. And so that's the framework they wanted to use when I examined this paper. Now, when President Biden was elected as president and he inaugurated office in 2017, there was, excuse me, it's still early, 2020, there was still, there's this expectation that his foreign policy would strengthen democracy, address human rights, and defend the liberal international order. And allies in Europe and Asia generally reacted positively to this return to a more traditional foreign policy approach after 4 years of uncertainty and kind of unorthodox the Trump administration's unorthodox foreign policy approach. And this was true even if some policymakers remained skeptical about whether the Biden administration could put forward a strong democracy agenda, because there's a consensus from some quarters of the world that because of intense polarization in US politics that we really can't it's going to be really difficult to get back on track to setting forward a liberal international agenda. Now, among US allies, of course, South Korea is also a strong democracy. It had a successful democratic transition in 1987 after decades of right-wing authoritarian rule. And South Korea has also touted its economic and political transformation as a model for other developing countries to follow. But at the same time, for those that follow South Korean politics, you've probably heard that it seems like the Moon Jae-in government had been a bit reticent in voicing some support for human rights in East Asia. It wasn't really a strong advocate for democracy in places like China or Hong Kong. Wasn't a strong advocate of freedom of expression, especially outside of its borders. And so it's been relatively muted. And so that's where you heard questions, even when Biden was first elected, whether there'd be some tensions between the United States and South Korea. And I think there hasn't been, because the Biden administration's aware that when Biden came to office, that South Korea would only have a year and a half left. So they didn't really push that agenda. So in the paper, because we're interested in identity here, I was trying to use identity as a variable in explaining foreign policy convergence and discord among alliance partners. And to do that, in the paper, I present a brief theoretical framework for understanding how identity and really ideology shapes foreign policy decision making. Now, of course, this isn't new, and for those that are versed in the constructivist literature, there's lots out there already. So this is more of a paper that kind of tests out the theories of identity as a form of alliance, discord, or alignment. And I'm not saying by any stretch of the means that identity is the only variable or even the most important variable, but I wanted to show in this paper how that plays out in a potential alliance, discord, or alignment in U.S.-South Korea relations. And then in the paper, I discuss how the Biden administration might press the next South Korean government, so the Yoon Suk-yeol government, on these values, these values-based issues moving forward. And these issues can include rights violations in China, North Korean human rights, and support for democracy and the rule of law across the Indo-Pacific. So I'll just briefly mention, I won't go into the theory, but I'll just say that current debates framing great power rivalry as a contest between democracy versus autocracy goes beyond geopolitical and ideological contestation. So we've been hearing a lot about the rise of a new Cold War, one underpinned by differences in ideology. I'm not going to get into a debate about whether that's actually the direction that we're moving or not, but certainly the narrative is moving in that direction, and we're seeing that with, at least U.S. government observations of China-Russia collusion in Ukraine. But I would also say that this contestation, if you think it exists between democracy and autocracy, is also rooted in differences in identity. And by identity, I'll just simply say it's seeing how nations or people and governments, how they see themselves as a nation, and where they have, what's their sense of belonging in the global or regional order. So that's, just a simple way of thinking about identities. And geopolitical conflict between democracies and autocracies at one level may be grounded or perhaps exacerbated by differences in state identity at another level. And so if I were to try to give some tangible examples of how you would try to measure or explore this, you can look at in-group, out-group biases found in Russian and US media coverage on the Ukraine crisis. Although I'll add, it's kind of unfair when the Russian state is blocking any sort of media outside. But when you look at in-group, out-group biases in media coverage, that might be one way of measuring differences in state identity. Or looking at US and Chinese media coverage of the Beijing Olympics might be a crude way of verifying the salience of identity as an important variable driving or at least exasperating geopolitical competition. So in the paper, I talk about political identity of the United States, or identity in US foreign policy. And here, you can go back, we all know the founding of the nation, the United States. There's lots of language about freedom, rights, values. And then I try to look at the Biden administration before, at different points of time in his career, but especially in his campaign and then in his first year in office, I pulled together a lot of different quotes or public statements that he made that pretty much verify this idea that human rights and democracy, liberal values are very much tied to the ethos of the United States and its foreign policy. So I don't think there's any disagreement there. And what you say what's in practice and what's in rhetoric, I mean, that's less important, but it's really how leaders are kind of associating their nation and their foreign policy with these values. That's important. And then I look at South Korea, and there's a question: does South Korea have a foreign policy identity? And maybe that's something that we can discuss here on the panel. Now, South Korea is a democracy for sure. I mean, there's no dispute about that. But does South Korea also embrace in its identity this notion of democracy, of liberal values? And identity is not fixed. It's fluid, and you can have multiple identities. And so maybe sometimes it may come out, and other times it doesn't. But on foreign policy, I would say that this democracy and this concept of liberal values is not really the most salient identity for South Korean foreign policy. And I don't know what is then the most salient identity, but something that runs along the lines of strategic vulnerability or autonomy. The whole analogy about South Korea being a shrimp among whales, that has often been the narrative, at least for South Koreans. And oftentimes we see policymakers, especially conservative policymakers, saying that they want to break past that, or we need to move past that. Even the Moon government was talking about moving past that and boosting its military spending. But so perhaps South Korea wants to be, in this push to become a global nation, they want to move past that identity. Yet they continue to come back to it. It comes back, and so that's where I would say that we can see potential discord, because the United States foreign policy is driven by a certain by its liberal identity, and because South Korea doesn't necessarily share that same identity and values, that's where there can be differences. So when the Biden administration says that they want to promote a democracy agenda in East Asia, South Korea may not necessarily be fully on board. The conclusion, and I'll be very brief because I don't know how much time I have left. But in the conclusion, I waited. I told Gil that I'll send you an updated paper after the elections. But I don't think the elections really, whoever, back in February, when I sent this paper, I said it doesn't really matter who becomes president, because identity should be, they're malleable, but they should still be more or less stable. So it shouldn't affect my paper too much. But in terms of the policy implications, I think that's what really matters, whether you have a conservative or a progressive South Korean government in power. And so we had Yoon Suk-yeol, a conservative, win the elections. And the assumption is that the conservatives are more pro-US, and he's talked about aligning with the United States on in the Indo-Pacific, becoming more engaged as an Indo-Pacific partner, about being willing to speak, voice concerns towards China, addressing issues like human rights. Those are all things that he said in the campaign. And so a question, I can get into the specific policy prescriptions, but a broader question is whether we can see a trend where South Korean identity, foreign policy identity, begins to converge more closely with that of the United States and other countries that have identified themselves as like-minded partners in the Indo-Pacific. So it'll be interesting to see how South Korea's role shapes up in the Indo-Pacific. How engaged will they actually be in something like the Quad, and whether they identify themselves as a democratic nation within the Indo-Pacific. So I think I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Before we move on to Gil, my one question for you is whether we're really dealing with a common terminology.
Mm-hmm.
So when we say human rights, do we all know what we mean by that? I've noticed that when the Moon administration was challenged on human rights in North Korea, they would say, yes, we care deeply about human rights in North Korea. People are hungry there. and we need to alleviate that. So is human rights just freedom of expression, or is it freedom from hunger?
I would say it's both, and you're right. The Moon government tended to focus on the social and economic aspect of rights, and I mean, it goes into long-standing debates at the UN about, that's why there's two conventions, one for political and civil rights and one for social and economic, and it's always been a debate, and those who are on the progressive or on the political left spectrum have tended to emphasize the social and economic rights, whereas those on the right, and those who are very anti-communist always emphasized the political and civil rights. But I think you have to I think it's unfair to separate these two things out. And so you're right. It's one way. I mean, I really felt that for the Moon government, they were in some ways deflecting the question about human rights. When you're challenging, when these North Korean human rights activists or defectors were challenging the administration or criticizing the Moon government for not addressing human rights, I felt like that was more of a tactic to say, oh yes, we are, and we care about food aid and humanitarian assistance. But that's not the So it's I think when we talk about human rights, you have to also bring it should be a comprehensive understanding of human rights.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, sure.
Before we move on to Gil, I should have mentioned at the beginning that I'm hoping we have a discussion among the panelists during the question and answer period too, so plan on addressing each other. Okay. Gil?
Okay, well, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank KEI for this opportunity. I regard this panel as pretty important because I think national identity is a huge factor in understanding developments in the Indo-Pacific and in South Korea especially. And so I was teaching a course on national identities and bilateral relations, began to develop a framework, did a comparative book on Chinese, Japanese, and South Korean national identities, did another book on bilateral relations with China, Japan, South Korea, and so on, looking at different pairs, and including Chinese demonization in the United States. So I'm really glad that this came together with papers that really help us understand this special time in the history of the region and South Korea and how identity matters. In fact, I would say of the three types of pressure, we paid the least attention to identity. Military pressure, North Korea is number one as affecting South Korea. Economic pressure, China is number one in affecting South Korea. But if we get to identity pressure, we've got coming from all sides. And the United States, even though we don't usually say it's high pressure, it's pretty important. And I think even more stress can be put on what's happened in the last few months with the summit of the democracies, and now the Ukraine war, and how the United States is approaching identity issues in this context. So I see all the 5 countries we're dealing with in this panel. Japan paper is not ready yet, putting interesting pressure on South Korea. And I see South Korea on the front lines and having made some important changes, particularly with the Biden-Moon summit in May of 2021. But even more challenges right now from the multilateral consensus Biden is trying to forge. So my paper focuses on what I consider the country that's putting the most identity pressure on South Korea in the most intense way over a number of years, and that is China. And we saw some of it during the Beijing Winter Olympics, particularly the South Korean reaction to China, the appropriation of Korean dress, the so-called biased officiating and speed skating. But the focus was on negative Korean views of China, whereas I think the root of the problem for the last 15 years has been the Chinese thinking about South Korea, about its history, about its links to the West. And a lot of that has to do with identity issues. It came to the forefront with the Koguryo controversy of 2004. It intensified with the culture wars and the hostility to Lee Myung-bak in 2007 and on, 2008 particularly. it came really to the forefront with the THAAD response, and not just the economic pressure, but the way the whole issue was framed, and what the Chinese have been writing about South Korea. And so it's not surprising that in a 2021 survey, 58% of Koreans said China is close to evil, and just 4.5% said it's close to good. So there just shows the sense of reaction. So I think South Korea is a prime test for China's wolf warrior diplomacy. And this paper that I've written for this group is parallel to a paper that I co-authored in the ASEAN Forum in January on how China is showing smile diplomacy while bearing wolf warrior teeth towards South Korea, co-authored with Danielle Cohn, looking at Chinese sources very intensely. Here, there's less intensity on the China side and more of an effort to talk about the South Korean reaction. So I regard wolf warrior diplomacy and rhetoric as having essentially begun with reaction to South Korea in the latter part of the 2000s, framing the challenge from South Korea as China was also veering closer to North Korea following the breakdown of the six-party talks, as a clash of identities. I call this the wolf warrior light. It was incipient and intermittent. And then when we get to 2016, 2017, I call what they were doing to South Korea with regard to THAAD, wolf warrior heavy. Lots of threats, warnings, red lines. It wasn't just criticizing the security implications, but much more than that. And then looking at the last periods, I call it wolf warrior as a cudgel in reserve, cushioned by various kinds of blandishments. So I call it the smile diplomacy bearing wolf warrior teeth. So we generally think of wolf warrior Chinese behavior as coming to the forefront with the response to Australia in 2018, 2019. But I would argue it was really THAAD that brought this very much to the forefront. What was presented as a security imperative was in fact bullying to teach a defiant state a lesson. Now, Seoul could draw lessons from what the Chinese are saying, although they often don't. You don't see, I mean, the public opinion has reacted very strongly, but there's not a lot of government response to what Chinese say about South Korea. But it could also draw lessons from the way wolf warrior behavior focuses on other countries, such as Australia, that dare to defy China's red lines. So what makes South Korea especially interesting case for understanding the wolf warrior phenomenon? I think it relates to historical memory. That when Chinese write about Korean history, and we covered that in a previous ISA KEI panel, they demonize Korean history frequently, far back. Of course, the Korean War is a big part of it. There's a different tone to Chinese warnings and explanations for its forceful responses. The traditional tributary relationship. South Korea is the poster boy for that. It was the number one sort of example of how China could behave hierarchically. The sense that culture is closely tied to China, that South Korea has no right to have a culture that is so distant and separating from China. There's also a sense that South Korea has already committed itself to balancing between China and the United States. It's violating an implicit promise under Roh Moo-hyun, or under even Moon Jae-in, when he gave the 3 no's about how he was going to deal with this. So there's a certain extra sensitivity to the disrespect coming from South Korea. And there's an argument that China has already accommodated South Korea in a lot of ways. And South Korea has an obligation to reciprocate. It's not just infringing on China's national security in its policy, it's infringing on China's Sinocentric worldview, on its identity, in some sense even its sovereignty. So I think the US is taking advantage of this kind of attitude. It's reinforcing the sense that it's time for Seoul to make a more definitive choice. And it's looking forward to working with President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol to sort of heighten the shared identity. So whether this means a closer alignment on the free and open Indo-Pacific, or it means a greater trilateralism with Japan because of the shared democratic identity and response to challenges such as China and North Korea, or it means speaking out more on human rights and what the real nature of the North Korean regime is. But above all, right now, it means Russia responding to the Russian transformation of the international order with the attack on Ukraine, and the US-led global response calling on allies and partners and others to stand up to this. But implicit in the response to Russia and the sense that Russia is being encouraged and with Chinese acquiescence and some degree of support, is the notion that the response to Russia relates to the response to China. That Russia's position on the Korean War is very much China's position. That Russia's use of, we'll go to that in the next statement, next paper, is parallels that of China. And so that if there is to be a more of a polarization of the world order in contrast to South Korea's inclination towards some kind of triangularity over the last 20 or so years, then this means identity is a big part of it, and Russia has brought identity to the forefront, and the US, is, under Biden particularly, is playing up these identity issues. So I think that the response of South Korea to China, more openly condemning Xinjiang atrocities and Hong Kong betrayal and other issues, is where we can expect to see this identity issue played out. And the other side of it is that China will be more likely to go to wolf warrior heavy again, not wolf warrior as a cudgel. And this China-South Korea relationship is in a very uncertain state right now. I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks, Gil. Before you transform into Tony Arena, let me ask one question about wolf warrior diplomacy. Reading your paper, I came up with a question of whether wolf warrior diplomacy is an assertion of national interest within the international system, or if it's rejection of the international system. I think this matters for identity because South Korea identifies itself as being a member of the rules-based order. So is China saying we all are, or are they saying we're trying to pull you away from the rules-based order?
I think the Chinese have a tendency to speak in a two-faced manner. They are a democratic country, they say, as they said with Russia on February 4th. They accept globalization and some aspect of the order, but by and large, Chinese publications reject that order. And they reject that they are seeking a more region-based order in which South Korea at least is not siding with the US, accepts China as an equal power, defers to China, and a lot of this is about respect, and it doesn't disrespect China by its movement. So I think it really is not within the order. Wolf warrior diplomacy and rhetoric tends to be a real attack on the fundamental assumptions of the order. It's more extreme than much of the rest of Chinese diplomacy, although it's come to the fore a lot. Australia being the obvious case of how extreme the rhetoric can often get.
Okay, thank you. Now be Tony Arena.
Okay, I'm putting on a new hat, a fur cap, of course, as we go further north. And Tony's paper is South Korean Responses to New National Identity Pressures from Russia. And he argues that in February of this year, the relationship between Seoul and Moscow changed fundamentally. After years in which Russian leaders put pressure on South Korea not to join US-led sanctions following Russia's seizure of Crimea and forcible separation of Donetsk and Luhansk, and hinted at even deeper support of North Korea, new threats were issued against taking part in the response to Russia's war in Ukraine. Moscow has tried to keep Seoul from honoring its national identity by not calling out Pyongyang for its human rights abuses and not calling out Moscow for its behavior, whether autocratic drift or invasion. So that is the way that Tony starts his paper. My own, just to add a little background here, I had a project on responses to the North Korean nuclear crisis in 2003, 2005, in that period. And I went to Moscow 2 or 3 times for research on that project and came away with the view that North Korea is of huge importance to Russia for its, what later became the turn to the east, for its view of how it could reassert itself as a great power, and that it, second only to China, it is seen as the vehicle for reestablishing Russia's importance in the region. And its position on South Korea has drifted into a more negative direction. But South Korea, like Japan, doesn't want to say that. And each South Korean president comes away with a new northern policy or a Eurasian initiative and claims that really good vibes are occurring between Putin and South Korean leaders and summits and elsewhere. And it's been very hesitant to speak out. So that is the background that I've been following over the years, and now we have a paper that gives us more evidence. Tony talks about a statement Putin made in May of 2000, shortly after he took office, and he said, historically and geopolitically, the Korean Peninsula always has been included in the sphere of Russia's national interest. And South Korea didn't complain. They said, okay, that's probably a good thing. They're going to be interested in doing things. But what it really meant, as we've seen over the years, is Russia would have to use North Korea because South Korea was in the sphere of US national interests. So Rena offers 5 perspectives in his analysis. First, what messages have come from Russia that could be considered putting pressure on South Korea? What has Russia been saying over the years? It's more indirect. It's not wolf warrior diplomacy. It's not China style. But what has it been saying to South Korea in meetings and in writings about Korea? And the writings about the Korean Peninsula tend to be from hardliners, by the way. There's virtually nobody with a sort of a balanced position. that writes about the Korean Peninsula in Russia. So almost no criticism after the 1990s of the Kim family, for instance, in North Korea. So that's the first thing. What do the Russian messages say? Second, how did the Moon Jae-in administration respond to this pressure prior to February of this year? How did they, they actually were dealing with Russia's attitude towards THAAD, which was very much China's attitude. They were dealing with the aftermath of the Crimean War, where South Korea did not put sanctions. Japan did put sanctions on Russia, despite Abe's personal relationship with Putin, tried to claim that there were the minimum sanctions and that it had to because it was in the G7, but South Korea did not. But the Russians still blame South Korea because they were abiding by the sanction rules, and they said it's just a fake that they claim they're not putting sanctions on us. So they didn't really take South Korea's independence very seriously, but that doesn't mean that the Moon administration reacted to that. Third, how did the Biden administration, with its emphasis on democracy and values, impact the thinking of the Moon administration before the Ukraine war and after it began? And here, I think there has been a notable impact. But it was less than in Japan. If you compare the two, you see the Japanese impact much more strongly in favor of the U.S. human rights positions and values positions. And during the run-up to the Ukraine war, joining more closely with the U.S. and South Korea more hesitant about that. Fourth, what has been the early impact of the transition of the Yoon administration, future administration, on Russia policy? We know more about its attitude towards China and Japan. People haven't paid that much attention to its reaction to the Ukraine war. And finally, what lessons should be drawn about South Korean national identity from this experience? The big broader questions that Andrew's already raised about the struggle in South Korea over its identity. How much is it allowed to talk about these critical issues, whether North Korean human rights or China's issues, or now the Ukraine war? How openly and strongly are they going to condemn that? So Moon Jae-in had welcomed a big role for Russia in the new Northern policy, even as Russia was tilting toward Pyongyang more fully, and warning that it could go further. After all, in 2017, when the big sanctions were applied to North Korea, and China went along, Russia did not want to go along. It did so at the last minute. It carved out an exception or two that turned out not to be successful, but it was sort of dragged by China into this. It didn't want to be. It wasn't going to be isolated in that. So Moscow's envoy to Seoul, Andrei Kulik, warned following Seoul's decision in February to participate in economic sanctions against Russia that the direction of Russia-South Korea ties could change course after over 30 years of developing in an upward trajectory. Such arguments have been backed by a revival of statements about the Korean War and the Cold War era, steeped in Soviet geopolitical and national identity assumptions hostile to Seoul. South Korea's decision to join sanctions against Russia potentially upends over 3 decades of this positive, but often more of a facade than any real depth. South Korea is constantly promising, we're going to go along with a massive infrastructure project with electrical lines and railroads and pipelines going down the Korean Peninsula from Russia. But we just need North Korea to cooperate. And that, of course, never happens. And Russia keeps saying, you're blocked by the United States. You can do much more. Do it now. And so Russia has constantly been saying to South Korea, you're not really doing what you promised to do. So But now Putin has presented the ROK with a test over whether it will stand as a member of the liberal camp or try to navigate between the two groups of states for the sake of pursuing interests centered primarily on the Korean Peninsula. But if they hesitate to call out what's happened in Russian identity and Russian policy, that would be like denying their own identity. And few in South Korea realize the extent of pressure being applied and of self-restraint being exercised. So that is essentially the argument that's made. If this test case of Ukraine materializes as it seems to right now, and South Korea joins clearly and fully with the liberal international camp, this will be taken badly in China, taken badly in North Korea, will be welcomed heartily in Japan, and it will contribute to the bipolarization taking place with identities being a big part of it. I'll stop there.
Okay. Thanks, Gil. I remember in 2010, I was working at the American Embassy in Seoul. This was the time that the North Korean submarine torpedoed and sank the South Korean ship at Chonan. Within days of that incident, I was at a reception, and a Russian diplomat approached me and said, "Mark, it's a shame, we'll never know what really happened." So that was their position immediately, and they stuck to it.
They stuck to it. They never changed, just like China never changed.
That's right.
And they knew what happened, but that was their policy at that time. And that shows even before the shift more clearly to North Korea, that was the telling indicator of how that shift was coming about. Mm-hmm. It could have been predicted in 2004 when I was reading the Russian materials on the North Korean nuclear crisis. I said they've already moved substantially to line up with North Korea much more than South Korea. So it was not something that I think was a huge surprise. And they started off in the nuclear crisis with sending their deputy foreign minister to Moscow, to Pyongyang, and said, "We can be the mediator in this crisis. Give us the opportunity." And then I was in Moscow watching this foreign minister the day he came back on a television show, and he was explaining that he didn't get what he wanted from the North Koreans, but nonetheless, that was the direction they were going to go. They're not going to be mediator, but they're going to side more fully with North Korea, was what came out to be.
Okay, and now Min Soon has what I said at the top was the ultimate test of Korean identity, which is inter-Korean relations.
So my chapter frames national identity a little bit differently from the existing literature on identity and constructivism in IR. So I look at diplomacy as sort of like a form of representation of national identity, where I frame diplomacy as a type of performance, right? In the sense that when leaders are out there standing in front of cameras, standing in front of the public, they are actually acting out, not just, they're not just being there doing their individual thing, they're there to represent a state, and of course the state's relations with its counterpart. In the sense that what the leader is trying to do in a summit, for example, is that it's trying to create an impression on the audience about the leader and the state, right? So there's this face work being done by the leader to sort of change the way how others view that state. So in terms of that, so just to help us recap on what North Korea looked like to the rest of us before Kim Jong-un made his debut on the international summitry stage around 2017. So if you actually remember, Kim Jong-un, when he took over his father in 2011, a couple of years later, he executed his own uncle. And he was also rumored to have purged the people who used to work for his dad. He also murdered his own half-brother in Malaysia. And of course, at the same time, North Korea was ramping up its nuclear missiles test and development. And in 2017, they basically became a de facto nuclear state. So this is how we all remember North Korea before he actually decided to come out and meet Moon Jae-in. So in 2017, 2018, we all know that Moon was basically giving a love call towards Kim Jong-un and North Korea, asking them to come to the negotiation table, right? And so if we actually take the idea that diplomacy is not just about leaders, standing in front of camera and acting out and performing, we also can actually interpret diplomacy as a form of transaction between states, right? In the sense that there must be something that South Korea has to offer to North Korea in order for Kim Jong-un to, show interest and say yes to Moon Jae-in's call for a summit. So if we actually take that transactional approach to this, what South Korea actually has to offer to North Korea, and that's within South Korea's own rights and capability, is to first then sort of convince North Korea that we'll sort of tone down our joint military exercises with the U.S. That's probably within South Korea's boundary to do so, right? To convince the U.S. that hey, if we actually do this, North Korea might actually come back to the negotiations table, and that's what happened. Second is what South Korea actually did was to then facilitate U.S. and North Korean leaders to meet together, because that's what North Korea has been demanding for decades, at least since the Clinton administration. But the U.S. has been turning down calls for a bilateral dialogue with DPRK. And so with those offers, that probably moved Kim Jong-un, right, and motivated him to come out to the rest of the world and sort of behave like a normal world leader. And that's what he did, right? So in fact, I interpret this Inter-Korea Summit series of 2018 as sort of like Kim Jong-un trying to do an impression management in front, not just in front of the world, but especially in front of the U.S. to sort of signal to them that, hey, we are like a reasonable state that you can actually negotiate and talk with. But what does the South Korean public actually think? If we were to actually take the idea that summit is a type of performance put up by leaders, there must have been some kind of effect on how not just South Korean politicians think about North Korea, but of course the South Korean public, right? And in this case, I look at both the elite's view or responses towards the Inter-Korea summits. In addition to the elite, I also look at public perception, because national identity is such a complex concept. I try to then identify the points or markers of where we can actually see and observe what South Koreans think about their national identity vis-a-vis North Korea. So obviously, for very obvious reasons, the conservatives of South Korea will always be critical of whatever Moon does with North Korea, right, for the sake of just criticizing him. So their first response to the Panmunjom Declaration, obviously they say like, this is fake peace, this is not real peace, like there's no tangible outcome, doesn't change the situation on the Korean Peninsula. They also obviously see summit as more of like a political spectacle put up by Moon and Kim, obviously. But their idea, the conservatives' idea towards the summit is that it should be used as a reward, right, for North Korea if they actually do something, if they actually do something substantial. So they're obviously very critical about the Inter-Korea summits. Now, for the South Korean public, they have a very interesting view towards Inter-Korea summit and dialogue, which I managed to sort of find on the internet for now. But that's also just part of my research project. So pre-summit around 2016, a lot of South Koreans obviously saw summit as more of an instrument, right? So they will want to use the summit with North Korea if it actually leads to a change in the security situation on the Korean Peninsula. But what happened in 2018 was that post-summit, after the first summit in April 2018, 77.5% of South Koreans actually thought that Kim Jong-un was a trustworthy leader. Now this is a drastic shift, right, from how we used to remember North Korea and Kim Jong-un before 2017, 2018, where I just, a few moments ago, where I raised the idea that North Korea is this rogue regime, and Kim Jong-un as being this very brutal leader, was obviously a state that no one wants to deal with. But post 2018 summits, South Koreans started changing their perception towards Kim Jong-un and North Korea, and thought that they are actually a country that or a counterpart that South Korea can actually work with. Now this is not just limited to the 2018 case. I found out that there were similar trends following the first summit, first Inter-Korea summit in 2000, and of course before the second summit in 2007. But we can't say that this actually will have a lasting effect, right? That's something that more research needs to be done. Now, from following the collapse of the Hanoi summit as well as the Stockholm working level talks between US and DPRK in Sweden in October 2019, Moon Jae-in realized that he can no longer rely on, producing nice visuals of Kim Jong-un being a normal leader anymore, because North Korea obviously decided to retract and go back to its, isolation mode. So what can Moon Jae-in actually do now? Now that North Korea decided to not be part of this international diplomatic stage anymore. So I sort of organized Moon's responses and approach into a so-called two-pronged approach, where he would actually attempt to persuade both North Korea and US, right, using different methods. So for North Korea, what Moon actually wanted, probably, and this is my interpretation, is that he probably wanted to persuade Kim Jong-un to reconsider coming back to the negotiations table, right? And to do that, and the conservatives and other people were obviously were being very critical of Moon's approach because they saw it as an appeasement. In Moon's interpretation, he probably wanted to just minimize any provocative, any provocations that would make North Korea really just burn the bridge and never come back to the diplomacy table, right? So he started doing things like, well, let's try to revitalize economic cooperation, because that sort of helps to sidestep the North Korea's economic situation because of these sanctions. And of course, you do things like banning the propaganda leaflets in late 2020 that actually brought a lot of criticisms. And then he obviously also then again proposed to scale down or to postpone the ROK-US military exercises. Now for the US, it's not very obvious. For the US, what he basically wanted to persuade the incoming Biden administration at the time in 2020 was to persuade them to prioritize diplomacy with North Korea, obviously, and to keep the Singapore statement that was signed between Trump and Kim Jong-un in Singapore in 2018. Now, why would he want to do that? It's not nothing, right? So my interpretation of Moon's move to actually make US prioritize diplomacy is to basically signal to North Korea that diplomacy option still remains on the table, right? So that they are actually on the same page about what US wants and what North Korea wants. Now, the problem with this two-pronged approach is that it was obviously a failure in many senses. Number one, North Korea overall continued to put out really hostile statements about South Korea and obviously about the US as well. But at the same time, there was leader-to-leader communication ongoing for a few months in early 2021 when it was revealed that Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un were exchanging letters. So there was leader-to-leader communication, but perhaps there was some kind of discord within the North Korean leadership at the time about what to do with diplomacy. And now that they have Biden administration, what are they going to do with the breakdown of nuclear diplomacy? Now, and then, however, as I said, North Korea continued to ramp up its hostility. For example, it blew up the Kaesong liaison office, and of course, it cut off the Inter-Korea military hotline, which became a real issue last year. And then it's sort of like North Korea was actually fluctuating in the sense that it restored the hotline and then it cut it off again. And Moon actually saw potential in that, right? The fact that North Korea was actually, it actually bothered to restore it and cut off again. It means that North Korea is perhaps responding to something. But we don't know, we actually don't know what North Korea was responding to exactly, and that's the problem. But here, so that was pretty much what happened until late last year. And so my analysis of what was happening between 2017 and 2021 between the two Koreas is that if you think about national identity, South Korea's national identity, it's kind of complicated, and I organized or I sort of analyzed South Korea's identity between its past identity and its present identity. So in the sense that, if you can actually see it, yeah. So South Koreans, conservatives, liberals, overall, they agree that there is a need for unification, or at least there is a need for peaceful coexistence between the two Koreas. There's no divergence on that. Now, the convergence, or there's no divergence on the past or the future identity, but there is divergence on what South Korea perceives its identity to be, relational or vis-a-vis North Korea, right? That's where a lot of divergence in different rhetorics manifest, and I point out that it manifests in two ways. So the first way how South Korea's divergence on national identity narratives manifest is in terms of how they interpret what Inter-Korea Summit means to South Koreans. The conservatives, as I've mentioned briefly just now, they tend to see summit as sort of like a reward to North Korea for something substantive that they have done, because they see the summit, right? And under the Westphalian state system, summits always present states on an equal status, on an equal basis. But some conservatives, some more extreme conservatives who are really anti-communist and anti-North Korea, tend to see North Korea as being inferior to South Korea. And so by having two leaders standing on the same stage, shaking hands, smiling in front of camera, that actually looks very unacceptable to some South Koreans, where we actually think that North Korea ought to be treated as a rogue regime, and so they are not really worthy for South Korean leaders to meet and treat them with diplomatic respect. In comparison, in contrast, the liberals see summit a little bit differently. They see it more as a tool, as an instrument for both Korea leaders to come together, have a dialogue and talk. Even if it does not lead to any tangible outcome, they see potential in that summits will actually lead to something more, right? So they take a more processual view towards summits. And so at the same time, we have to remember that how liberals perceive summit is not just summit, right? So while we are having dialogue and diplomacy with North Korea, the Moon Jae-in administration was also, again, strengthening South Korea's own defense capabilities. So they're literally compartmentalizing dialogue from South Korea's national security issues. And so we also have to remember that when Moon actually called for diplomacy in 2017, soon after he came into power, in 2017, the security situation on Korean Peninsula was actually very tense. And so we have to remember that even if you were a conservative leader in South Korea at the time, something would have happened, right? Something that's close to a dialogue or close to diplomacy would have been attempted, even if not for a liberal government. Now, so the second way how South Korea's present identity vis-a-vis North Korea manifests is by looking at how the elites and South Korean public perceive North Korea. So as I've said, conservatives tend to be critical about whatever the Moon Jae-in government has been doing because their job is to just criticize the ruling party and the government. South Korean public, on the other hand, they're a lot more vague in terms of what they think about South Korea's identity ought to look like today, right, vis-a-vis North Korea. What I found is that based on looking at public opinion polls that was conducted by the Korean Institute of National Unification last year, is that generally most South Koreans actually do prefer dialogue, whether it is successful or not. Because I think there is this preference that we are somehow engaging with North Korea, even if it doesn't lead to any substantial action by North Korea. It's better to talk than to not talk, right? And so conservatives probably, they're not really reflecting what the South Korean public actually thinks about summits. They think that it is a political show, which I do agree. But the political show put out during a summit is actually doing something to sway the South Korean public's perception towards North Korea and inter-Korea relations. Now what does that say about what the Yoon administration is going to do about North Korea? So there are certain continuities. For example, Yoon has actually decided to continue Moon's policy of actually continuing keeping the humanitarian assistance regardless of the political situation, right? And he also wants to definitely improve relations with North Korea. There are some changes which I find is more rhetoric than being actual policy differences. So for example, he said that you know what, he will do a summit, he will meet with Kim Jong-un only if North Korea agrees to do something substantive again. But as I've said, that's what Moon exactly did in 2017. There was a need to actually reach out to North Korea and tell them to come back to the table and talk, right? So we can actually expect something similar to happen under the Yoon administration. Now, one thing that Yoon is actually trying to overturn in terms of what the Moon government has achieved with regards to inter-Korea relations was that he actually advocaate scraping or getting rid of the 2018 military agreement signed between the two Koreas. The problem with this is that basically it means remilitarizing the demilitarized zone. And we all know that the military agreement actually did lead to less, provocative actions and fewer incidents along the demilitarized zone following this military agreement. So this might escalate things, we're not sure, right? But at the end of the day, we can't just say that whatever Yoon does will make a difference to how North Korea will respond, because it's literally we're just literally waiting for North Korea to actually do something, or to not do something in terms of provocations, but do something in terms of actually reaching out to either South Korean government or Washington D.C. To discuss and negotiate denuclearization. So things are kind of still up in the air, I feel like, because we already had probably 10 or 11 missile tests, I think, as of today. And it seems like Kim Jong-un is not going to slow down. We'll just have to see what will happen once Yoon gets, once Yoon actually enters not the Blue House office, but his office somewhere. We just have to see what happens. So that's the end of my presentation on my paper, and thank you for listening.
We've got about 20 minutes left, so let me do one quick round of questions, and then maybe we could have the panel ask each other questions or make observations if you have. Then we'll turn to the audience. Let me go back to Andrew. I was struck in your paper by this distinction between countries that are great powers and therefore can afford to be values promoters, like the United States, and medium-sized or smaller countries have strategic vulnerability, and therefore they're less able to be in that position. But there are medium, small countries that are great values promoters, like Sweden. That's how they see themselves. So what makes Korea different in that regard? Is it the neighborhood, or?
Until the Ukraine invasion, I would have said probably the neighborhood, but now we see Sweden is also, and Finland, these countries are in a precarious situation. So, that's an excellent question, because if you do these comparisons between Europe and Asia, what makes South Korea, I think, different? And I don't have a good answer to that now, because on one hand, you could say the argument for Korean experts or Northeast Asia experts is that South Korea the Korean Peninsula has always been in this historically strategically vulnerable position, surrounded by great powers. But there have been wars in Europe, throughout continental Europe for centuries as well too. So you can't fall back on the history argument that's been ingrained within South Korea, this geopolitical vulnerability. So then, is it a question of the strength of a liberal identity, or the strength of certain normative values, and is it because Sweden and other Western democracies have had a long, in the formation of their state, has this been an integral part to their state formation, and is that absent in South Korea, or Korea's and South Korea's political development, this idea of democracy. So I don't have quite the answer to your question, but that might be one hypothesis that we could tease out about state formation, and at what to what degree did certain values or ideology become a core part of a state's identity.
Okay. And then Gil, the question's been made a little bit irrelevant by the Ukraine war, but I'm still wondering, as kind of a historical point, could Russia-South Korean relations have been better if Russia had not been basketed with a new northern policy? I mean, with North Korea and China, it was always going to be tough. And then the new northern policy couldn't get any traction. What if they just treated Russia as a separate entity?
Well, I think the New Northern Policy essentially treats Russia as separate. I don't think there's
okay.
much else in it. The Eurasia Initiative may have looked like it was a little broader scope when Park Geun-hye, but I don't know that there's much meat to the New Northern Policy apart from the sort of triangularity. And also there was the easy travel between Seoul and Vladivostok, dropping the visas so that before the pandemic, Russians were getting somewhat excited by the large number of South Koreans, the only ones really, except for the Chinese going to the casinos that were going to Vladivostok. So I think that was as part of the Moon's effort to encourage the Russians, but I don't think there was much more to the New Northern Policy. I mean, a little bit on Mongolia, for instance.
And then for Min Sun, my question is about this tension you described in your paper between Korean desire for better inter-Korean relations and the desire among South Koreans for more security. That's a real objective. So I'm kind of wondering if inter-Korean relations are seen as a step toward unification, as opposed to a step towards stabilizing relations between two separate countries. I mean, what's the preference? Is it towards unification or is it towards stability between two countries?
So I think as of 2022 or as of 2021, I think there is a general preference for stability first, then unification. Or instead of unification, I think majority of South Koreans actually do prefer peaceful coexistence. So being, having two territories, sort of like, forming a federation where, ordinary Koreans can actually cross the border, but we won't have like a unified government. And because North Korea has been very, very, they have been producing and sort of disseminating a lot of visuals on their ICBM test and whatnot. I think there is a sense that South Koreans, that will actually make South Koreans prioritize stability a lot more than they would have, because it's out there, right? This is happening. Like the missile tests are actually happening. That's non-refutable. And so I think the younger generations obviously also do prefer peaceful coexistence over unification, and that's actually going to be, and so I think there is going to be this divergence between how the older generation or how the politicians in South Korea think about North Korea versus how the younger public, how younger South Koreans actually think about our northern brother. And I think it is a little bit irreconcilable, but at the same time, at this moment, I think most South Koreans do prioritize physical security over what we think that, what is our ideal picture of the two Koreas.
Yeah, I have to say I'm a little bit skeptical of polls that show what people think about unification, because it's unlikely to come about as a result of a vote. It's going to be some event. So conceivably North Korea could collapse, or conceivably you could have a rapid pickup of inter-Korean dialogue. Either way, the public's not going to decide on unification. They're going to be kind of confronted by it. It's happened in Germany.
And I totally agree with that. So the interesting thing is that even conservative governments in the past have always called for unification, right? So if you all remember how Park Geun-hye used to have this slogan about inter-Korea relations, sort of she's trying to put out this message to South Koreans that, hey, look, unification is going to be good for us. It's going to be a bonanza. And using such terms, using such words to actually express inter-Korea relations, it goes to show that the elites are trying really hard to convince South Koreans that there is something positive out of having better relations with North Korea. So I feel like things are a lot. I mean, like you said, I'm also skeptical of the opinion polls, but as of now, that's the best way to actually sort of gauge what the public is actually thinking.
Yeah, Park Geun-hye talked about the bonanza. I remember Lee Myung-bak talked about a unification tax.
Right, exactly.
To help save money to pay for unification.
Exactly.
Can I jump in on
Please,
there
I'll
as
get
well
out of the
too?
way
Because
now. Yes.
I mean, I also agree too that peaceful coexistence is the sentiment of many Koreans. And when you have this inter-Korea summit, they're not looking for unification. At best, there has to be some stepping stone in between. to get to the unification. But I'm wondering if this is where there needs to be some change in the policy narrative or discourse, because as Minsun was saying, it's impossible for any politician to come out and say publicly that we don't want unification, or unification is not the end goal. It's like you have to say it, even whether you believe it or not. And the public already is at that point where, they're, especially the younger generation, where maybe unification is a long-term ideal, but right now we're thinking about peaceful coexistence. But to get policy elites and politicians to say that or think that, I'm not sure what it would take. So it's interesting to see if maybe the Yoon government tries to take a stab at changing what the policy elite discourse is on unification. And on the flip side, I was thinking about the United States, because we have the issue of denuclearization, how no US government can come out and say that denuclearization isn't our stated end goal. I think it will always be the stated end goal, but if you talk to practitioners or policymakers, they're all super skeptical that North Korea is ever going to give up their nuclear weapons. And so, should the goal be security, stability, arms control? So there has to be also, I think, a shift. There has to be a shift in maybe the way we talk about North Korea and kind of end goals and within U.S. policy circles as well too. I understand that for the U.S. it's because it's not just about the Korean Peninsula; it's about the non-proliferation regime and what that signals if you were to stop saying that the end goal is denuclearization. But that's where you have these ironies where policy elites in practice think one thing, but then because of certain ideals or other complicated issues tied up with the specific issue of Korea, North Korea's nuclear program, you can't go out and actually say what perhaps you're thinking internally.
On all of our papers, I think there could be more stress on the last few months and even the coming months, because we're still working on these papers in April. And it seems to me that we've moved a long way because of not so much the Ukraine crisis itself, but because of the US policy push. Something new is going on. And so I would like to get a greater emphasis that this is 2022, that we want to be really up to date. And so does South Korea's attitude toward North Korea change because of this new situation and this new South Korea-US relationship that Yoon welcomes, and Biden will be pushing even harder with more emphasis on Japan, for instance, in the coming months than on North Korea, unless North Korea creates a crisis. And then North Korea will be looking like Russia in creating this bipolarization and danger. And so I would like to see how we can bring that to the forefront here.
Yeah, I agree. Things are changing. I think the Biden administration is different in its approach towards North Korea. I've been very struck that President Biden himself has talked about the goal as being ultimate denuclearization. To me, that sounds like the end of the road, not a precondition for better relations. So I think they are pushing it back, like Andrew's suggesting they might want to. On the unification narrative, it's tough to change until they can amend the constitutions of both South and North Korea. The constitutions call for unification, so how do you deny that?
Yeah, that's a great point. So for Gil, one suggestion, because this is a collection, as you may have already alluded to, I think a lot of the papers are talking about identity, but I don't know if somewhere in your introduction you need to kind of corral and think about because they're different, how we're all using the term identity, and I don't know if in the introduction if it would be worthwhile not to come up with a single definition of identity or how it's used, but just have some discussion about what we mean by national identity and how it's interpreted different ways by the different authors contributing to the volume. And a quick question is on Russia. You had mentioned about Russia's pressure on South Korea, but I'm curious how much pressure Russia actually has, or how much leverage the Russians have over South Korea, because economic ties are nowhere near as they are between South Korea and China. And I remember looking at statistics, they're like maybe number 11 in terms of trade
I think the nature of the pressure is mostly North Korea, what Russia can do with North Korea. So I think with China, that's a big factor too, but with Russia, it's almost the only factor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is kind of striking that the South Korean GDP is bigger than the Russian GDP.
Oh, yeah. Like Russia was number 11 before this collapse of the ruble, and South
Now
Korea was
it's-
10.
That's, even before that, that's correct. Okay, audience questions, please.
That's a question for Gil. With you essentially saying he's going to reject the 3 no's and really clearly side with the U.S. more so, but at the same time saying, oh, we're going to keep good relations with China. It's a little hypocritical. I mean, it's a little difficult position for him. So what is your expectation for China's response to, let's say he does, really come out clearly with the U.S., more on the regional security. Let's say he increases joint exercises, he does all the things that China doesn't want. What do you expect China's response to be?
I think that's a very good question. And I think if you read Chinese articles over the last 5 years, there have been many indications that they will not accept those kinds of changes. They warned South Korea about taking many steps. And policy towards Japan, one of the 3 no's is missile defense with Japan and coordinate trilateralism. They've been saying a lot about the Indo-Pacific. China doesn't agree with Indo-Pacific. It's all containment, and warning South Korea about that. They're warning about technology changes, how South Korea could alter its relationship with China in terms of economic security. One after another, South Korea will be crossing these putative red lines, and I don't think that China will accept that. A THAAD expansion would be the very obvious turn. So what would China do? I think both in terms of North Korea policy and in terms of economic and cultural responses, we can see them doubling down on what they did in 2016. So I think THAAD 1 is a warning for where we're going to hit next. And in terms of language, I think we'd get heavier wolf warrior policy, probably more extreme than we've seen to Australia or anyone else, because South Korea is the poster boy for what China considers its rightful sphere. So that's my expectation.
Just briefly as a follow-up, do you think Yoon understands this, that this could be
I think,
always new in politics like this?
Yoon wants to accomplish many things, and without talking about the trade-offs. And it's also true that previous South Korean leaders have been reluctant to talk about the cost of some of the policies. So I don't know I suppose some of the knowledgeable advisors are aware of it, and they're saying, well, at least public opinion is so negative on China now, we can do it that way. And the United States is so backing, it won't be like 2016, where South Korea felt it was alone with Chinese sanctions. This time, they will be more, they'll think that the United States has their back much more. So I think those are reasons why Yoon might be more ready to do this.
Okay, please, yes.
Hi, I'm Lani Kia from the College. I have a question for Dr. Yap. So you mentioned that the U.S. policy is driven by democracy and human rights, whereas South Korea's foreign policy isn't. But one could argue that both countries' policies are driven by strategic interests.
Mm-hmm.
But the U.S. employs democracy and human rights as sort of instruments to undermine the legitimacy of China. But for South Korea, it is inconvenient to
Mm-hmm.
emphasize democracy and human rights in its attempt to navigate the great power competition between the U.S. and China. And similarly, so is India's foreign policy. When India joined the Quad, India was touted as a democracy, even though there are flaws in its democracy, but it's reluctant to join the international communist sanctions against Russia. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, that was my caveat at the beginning where I said that identity isn't necessarily the most important variable in driving foreign policy. And for sure, I think strategic interest many times trumps these normative values or arguments driven by human rights. So in that sense, if you're a realist, you would say none of this really matters, because at the end of the day, states make their choices based on strategic interests. But I think that's where maybe you could test this by looking outside of the China case. And what is the U.S. Promoting in other parts of Asia? And so if we step away from China and look at things like support for civil society in Southeast Asia, or women's empowerment. So how much is South Korea contributing to other ways? So things that go under the radar that may not draw the attention of China. And I feel like the Moon government, in their language, with the new Southern policy, they did talk about some of these things, like women's empowerment, supporting civil society groups that are promoting democracy. But if South Korea wants to engage on the Indo-Pacific front much more, I think we should be seeing the Yoon government increasing its steps, increasing some of these policies and programs within the region. So I do think that strategic interests, especially on the China front, are dictating South Korea's policy. But because South Korea hasn't really been a very strong promoter, I think, of democratic rights in other parts of the region, it's, to me, I think it's because it doesn't really put that as a core. South Korean governments don't put democracy and human rights as a core value to promote within its region and within its foreign policy.
Okay, time's kind of drawing to a close. Let me just ask one more question to both Gil and Min-Seo, and it's a similar question, and then we'll wrap up. If the goal of Beijing and Pyongyang is to create a divide between South Korea and the United States, why don't they woo South Korea rather than bully it? Both China and North Korea could offer South Korea things, but they don't seem to want to do that. What prevents them from being more carrot and less stick?
Well, that was a question that was raised in the early 2000s when China saw a very positive public opinion, and yet they allowed the Goguryeo issue to arouse South Koreans to think that China was stealing Korean history, and it was a shock. And then there were the culture wars, and you kept asking yourself, well, why, if they have a country they want to drive a wedge through, are they doing these insanely counterproductive things one after another? And I think it's partly a sense that they just don't take South Korea very seriously as a force. I would say it's similar to Russian thinking in a way, that this is some kind of non-autonomous state under U.S. influence that doesn't respect us and doesn't defer to us. And we're so strong, we don't really have to. We have other leverage, our economic power is so great, we can make sure this country is beholden to us and can't do much about it. It's a sign of arrogance.
Okay.
That's what I would say.
And then, Min-Seo, the same applies to North Korea. It'd be so easy for Kim Jong-un to have been nice to Moon Jae-in. He could have given him a few things, but he didn't. Why not?
So I think, with regards to North Korea, I think their number one priority is to work their way around international sanctions. Right? So just like how South Koreans actually prioritize physical security over their ontological security or identity narratives, I think the North Korean leadership definitely does want to, at least have some kind of, partial sanctions relief, lifting sanctions, so that they can, develop and progress. So I have been thinking about the whole idea of how diplomacy is a transaction. So, in the sense, by agreeing to come to the negotiations table and stand in front of camera and laughing and joking and drinking with Moon Jae-in, I think Kim Jong-un was actually doing South Korea a favor, or rather Moon Jae-in government a favor. What can North Korea do more than just that? Now, so the idea of unification in both Koreas is a very complicated issue. It's not just about, oh, we decide to end the war, sign an agreement, and we'll unify. That's not it, right? So in both the constitutions or in both, the legal basis in both Koreas with regards to unification is that there can only be one legitimate government. And so with that, it's not, within South Korea too, it's not just about, oh, as long as, North Korea looks peaceful, we're happy with that. Some South Koreans actually do want to go further than that to say that, look, if we even want to exist, coexist peacefully with North Korea, it has to be somewhat done under South Korea's conditions too. Like, we don't want, I don't know if we actually want Kim regime to be there forever, right? There has to be some sort of like give and take between, South Korea and North Korea in the sense that, well, even if we were to exist, peacefully, we don't want that kind of brutality or, a hostile regime. So in that sense, there is this, so at the core of it, I see it as more as a legitimacy struggle, right? Even if North Korea offers something to South Korea, will we be willing to accept that? Because that could actually be a way, that could actually be signaling to North Korea that we are actually willing to give a lot more, but that's not true. Like some South Koreans, as I've said, are really just adamant and they're really against seeing North Korea as our equal, like an equal partner that we can work with. So I think that's, so the bottom line is I think it's a lot more complicated than North Korea being able to give South Korea something.
Okay, that's very helpful. I'm still looking for the issue that gets simpler the more you look at it. It never seems to happen. Okay, my last word is that reading all these papers and being on the panel has actually changed my thinking. I was thinking about the choices that South Korea needs to make between China and the US. But now I'm thinking it's actually about South Korea trying to balance among the US, China, other countries, and Korean ethno-nationalism. It's a much more complicated equation. That's worth knowing. Okay, thank you for joining us. Please subscribe to the KEI YouTube channel. We'd appreciate that. Thank you very much. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.